Shalom friends, welcome to Daf Reactions, Gittin 57. I'm going to start out by saying that this one is going to be a little different from my normal material. When I started learning the Talmud, I knew that there were going to be pages we were going to encounter that have been used historically as a rationale for anti-Semitism. This is one of those pages, and honestly, I do approach it with a great deal of trepidation. It is very possible that I might get banned for this video, but I think it's important to talk about it despite that. And I'll tell you why. But first, this stuff does contain a lot of very heavy themes. These include real, disturbing historical events and one completely fictional story that is gross, but fictional, that has been unfortunately used throughout history by Christian governments and people in positions of power to say, look, the Jews really deserved all the bad things that ever happened to them in the history of the world. This is enough reason to unalive them. In fact, if you search the word Talmud on this app, you will find a lot of videos saying the same thing. If these topics don't seem like something you want to encounter right now, I completely understand and keep scrolling. I totally get it. For those of you who are still here, okay, at this point you already know the past few pages of the Talmud have been discussing the horrors surrounding the Roman occupation and destruction of Jerusalem. On today's page, we just get into like way more miserable topics, such as the story of Hannah and her 7 sons who all become martyrs, another awful story that talks about how a whole boat full of children who had been abducted and were going to be sold into something that rhymes with textual knavery all leap overboard in order to avoid that fate. The unaliving of entire towns and cities. It's really depressing. The thing is, nobody in the Talmud had a therapist. They were dealing with real immediate pain that had been inflicted upon them in the very recent past, and they were still living out. And we see a lot of self-blame in these pages for these events. For example, the whole story of Kamsa versus Bar Kamsa, which was just an Evite gone wrong, that is supposedly the whole reason why this destruction happened. We also see this trauma show up in this page as venting towards people in authority who are seen as being against the Jewish people or harmful or dangerous to the Jewish people. There is a real irony to knowing that this story on this page that we're going to talk about was essentially kind of an expression of this deep-seated agony in the form of a creative writing exercise. But the story that came out of it has again been used as a real reason to unalive us. It begins with Onkelos, who was the nephew of Titus, and he's considering converting to Judaism. So he does his due diligence, which in this case involves him using necromancy to raise 3 people from the grave to have a little convo about the Jews, like a little pop quiz. He raises Titus, who says the Jews have way too many commandments, and I think some people would agree. Onkelos then asks what his afterlife experience has been like thus far, and it hasn't been great. Every day, he is burned, and they gather his ashes, and then put him together again, and then burn him again, and scatter his ashes again. It's giving Prometheus a little bit. Onkelos then does the same for Balaam, who doesn't like the Jews but says they're important. And when you have just been squished into the dust by an empire, sometimes you do want to hear that you're important. I get why there is this revenge fantasy element. Onkelos then asks what his afterlife has been like thus far, and it's even worse. He spends his time in, how do I say this so as not to be banned, boiling sea, pause, men. The next guy he raises from the grave is probably supposed to be Jesus. And possible Jesus says that Onkelos should really do right by the Jewish people and never do anything against them. Around this time, there was more than one Jewish person who developed a following who were convinced that they were the Messiah. They were viewed as Jews, but Jews who were trying to get their fellow Jews to engage in idol worship and mocking the words of the sages, which is a big no-no. As such, in this fictional story, Jesus says what his afterlife experience has been, and it has been hanging out in a pool of boiling this emoji. I will say, if it makes anyone feel better, I have been told on multiple occasions that this will be my fate too when I pass away because of this very series. It's just going to be me and Jesus and Shabtai Tzvi swimming along together, I guess. By the self-blame logic that happens on this page, we could well say This is our fault. Nobody should have ever thought of the story, let alone write it down, so it couldn't have been used to persecute us. It's our fault for doing that. But I reject this completely. The difference is this story is fictional, and nothing fictional will ever be as offensive as hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years of real, brutal persecution, exile, and torment. This has been quite an unfun episode of DAF Reactions, but I think we needed to address the elephant in the room.